Okay, welcome back everybody and good afternoon. The time is 2 o'clock and the inquiry is resumed. Okay, does anybody wish to raise any matters before we head to the Affordable Housing Roundtable? Okay, thank you. So if I could just get both Mr. Axe and Mr. Symes just to confirm who will be taking part in this, please.
For our side, sir, it's going to be Mr. Stacey, who's to my left.
Okay, thank you. Would you both, are you happy where you are? Would you like to move to the front level? It's just, if it involves moving lots of things, then it's fine. You're only one row back. Okay. Thank you for that. It just helps me sort of understand who's taking part. Thank you. Okay, so this session I suppose has largely been called for by the appellants. So perhaps it's probably best to start with you, Mr. Stacey, so sort of an overview of what you want to talk about.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. So from my perspective, I think it's important for you to understand how I get to very substantial weight as opposed to the council's position, which we know is substantial weight. So I say that I take a layered approach and presented fairly detailed evidence in terms of looking back in terms of how the council had performed, considered that against the requirements in the SHMA, and then I've looked forward as well. So I don't see any comparable evidence from the local planning authority in terms of the data that I've looked at. None of it was contested in a rebuttal or anything of that nature. And in fact, the council have really only provide one paragraph in Mrs. Cook's proof of evidence at 4.53, where affordable housing is discussed. So I think in that context, I don't really understand how she's arrived at substantial weight. But I think it's important that I set out why I say it's very substantial weight. So looking back, first thing to look at is the past delivery position. And we've seen from the addendum to the Statement of Common Ground, ID1 and ID2, that we have some updated positions in terms of the net past delivery record, taking into account the gross position obviously is from the council's own figures. Right to buys are taken from government live tables, and subsequently we've added back in the acquisitions to that. On those figures, there's a net reduction of 63 affordable houses per year, and figure 2.1 of my addendum sets out the net position of affordable housing over the last 7 years. And there we can see in the second from last column that there's been delivery of 37 net affordable housing units over the 7 years. That's 5 dwellings on average per annum, and that's equivalent to 1% of total market completions. So that is an important context to understand where we are in terms of looking back. I've then gone through to compare that net delivery in respect of the SHMA requirements, and that's figure 2.2 of my addendum ID2. And we've heard this figure mentioned this morning, and of a shortfall of 2,494 dwellings, which is equivalent to 356 dwellings per annum. I'll come on to the significance of these in a minute when we look at some appeal decisions, and I've only got 2 paragraphs of really one appeal that I'd like to put before you, but that figure is important from the appellant's perspective in terms of the past position and where they're at in that respect. I've then, as part of my evidence, looked at how that backlog of 2,494 would be dealt with if it were to follow the Sedgefield approach to removing the backlog, and that's figure 2.4 of my addendum ID2, and that would result in a net figure over the next 5 years of 860 dwellings. And again, that's important when I come on to look at the potential future supply arising from the council's 5-year housing supply statement. Also looking in the future then at that 5-year position, my main proof of evidence at paragraph 7.14 through to 7.20 has considered applying the past gross delivery rate of 14%, which is set out in my figure 6.1 on page 20, to the council's total supply within the housing land supply statement, which is CD 124. So of that, there's 4,234 dwellings, 14% of that if the past delivery rate were to continue, and that's the best evidence that we have in terms of that. That would equate to 119 new homes per annum on a gross basis. Sorry, let me say that again. That would equate to 593 homes over the 5-year period, equivalent to 119 per annum. If we were then to apply the net position in terms of assuming that the right to buy losses and acquisitions continue at the prevailing rates, that would reduce the gross figure by 63 homes per annum, which would lead to a future annual supply of 56 homes per annum arising from the council's sites within their housing land supply statement. And then I would compare that to the 860 homes that we've talked about over the same period to remove the backlog and apply that to the annual SHMA need. So I say the 56 homes would be a drop in the ocean compared to the needs over the next 5 years. Section 8 of my proof of evidence, and I don't need to go through all of these, but that sets out what I call affordable indicators, and we don't have a view from the council on any of these matters in terms of the housing register, which has seen an increase of 701 households in the last year, which would be equivalent to 13 households joining the register each week. We've heard the preferences this morning in terms of the number of people on that register that are specifying a preference, and it's one of their areas of preference for Billericay, and that's 1,119. So almost 50% of the register. Some of the other indicators that I've considered, again, we've touched on some of these in cross-examination of Mrs. Cook, which was the bids against the number of lettings. So I think that's an important consideration. helps me with my understanding of the acuteness of the affordable housing need in this district. And then I've gone through other ones such as temporary accommodation, which we see that there's 214 households housed in temporary accommodation. That's at 20th of May 2022. And then there's 17 households were housed outside of the borough on that same date. The Help to Buy register again is part of my evidence. This is paragraph 830 and 831 of my main proof. And there I've identified that there's 727 households on the register specifying a requirement for a shared ownership accommodation in Basildon, and drilling down, we know that 311 of those are specified a preference for a shared ownership property in Billericay. And the context of that is that we're providing 5% of the affordable as shared ownership. So there's clearly a need in terms of the shared ownership accommodation as well as the general housing arising from the housing register. Other indicators in that section, and they're generally all worsening or high, is homelessness, private rent, the affordability ratios, which I think is important to highlight. This is in the context of an agreed national housing crisis in the Statement of Common Ground. Median affordability ratio of 10.4 times income in 2021, and the lower quartile, which I would align more to those in need of affordable housing, is 10.9 times their income. I set out a fairly lengthy section on house prices and lower quartile and median house prices increasing. This is on pages 38 through to 42 of my proof, and we can see from the various graphs there, 8.4 and 8.6, that those are increasing. So that is a part of my layered approach to understanding why it's not just about numbers in terms of the council suggesting that 21 is not a huge number. 21 in the context of delivering 5 a year, I think is fairly significant, and part of the justification for suggesting that very substantial weight should be given to the planning, to affordable housing in the planning balance. Within my proof of evidence, I set out a section on benefits and consequences. I think they're fairly well known and established, so I don't particularly need to labour on those points. In terms of perhaps just turning up one appeal for consideration, and again some context in terms of how another local authority perhaps compares to Basildon. CD 127, sir, is the Bullens Green Lane Colney Heath appeal decision. CD 127.
Which paragraphs?
Yes, so it's paragraph 53 and 54 on page 12, sir. I don't know the PDF reference number.
Thank you.
So if we're looking at paragraph 53, I should say that I presented evidence in this case following the same approach that my proofs undertaken here. So paragraph 53 says the uncontested evidence presented by the appellant on affordable housing for both local authorities illustrates some serious shortcomings in terms of past delivery trends. And I record here that that's 1% net delivery. In relation to, this is well in Hatfield Borough Council, the affordable housing delivery, which has taken place since 2015-16, is equivalent to a rate of 23 homes per annum. And I've identified in my figure 2.2 that it's 5 in Basildon. The appellant calculates the shortfall stands in the region of 4,000 net affordable homes since the 2017 SHMA update. So we have a shortfall here over a different period and a different need calculation, but a comparable figure of 2,494 homes shortfall. Then it goes on to say, if the shortfall is to be addressed within the next 5 years, it would require the delivery of 1,397 affordable homes per annum. And again, I've identified a similar figure here of 860 homes. And then it sets out the position in respect of St Albans as well. And then paragraph 54 talks about the persistent under-delivery of affordable housing in both local authorities presents a critical situation, taking into account the extremely acute affordable housing position in both. I attach very substantial weight to the delivery of up to 45 affordable homes in this location in favour of the proposals. And so I say that there's similarly very serious shortcomings in respect of Basildon, and I would equally say that it's a critical situation for those households on the housing register who we know are real people in real need, and that need now is now and needs to be addressed. In respect of that address, it doesn't seem like the future supply is going to do that in the short term, and in the longer term we obviously have problems in respect of the planning policy, which Mr. Bell will touch on. So adding all those factors together, comparing it in some ways to the Colney Heath decision, Basildon does appear in some respects to be in a worse situation in respect of the past delivery. I say it's entirely appropriate that very substantial weight should be given to this benefit in this case. The only other point to note, sir, and this just arises from Mrs. Cook's consideration of the benefits to housing, my appendix JS9 has set out a series of appeal decisions where the Secretary of State and inspectors have considered affordable housing on a individual basis as part of the planning balance. So that's just a point to note in respect of part of my evidence. I think that's all I need to say.
I wondered whether you could, might I just ask Mr. Stacey just to comment on one more thing on that, after that comprehensive presentation, was there was an answer given to, I think it was an evidence in chief from Mrs. Cook about the justification for giving substantial but not very substantial weight to the provision of affordable housing, and it was to do with, I think, in the end, how many homes are being provided. She said it's only whatever it is in the low 20s. I can't remember what the figure is.
21. My note says she said it was not a huge amount.
Not a huge amount, and
didn't
therefore substantial.
Yeah.
Substantial. So it was just really just to get your view on that approach, if you like, as a matter of principle when trying to determine what the appropriate weight might be.
I think it's important to look at the percentage of affordable housing that's being delivered. I think on that scenario, 21 units is an enhanced offer. It's at 45% as opposed to the policy requirement in the SPD. And there's a debate about whether you can introduce a policy in an SPD, obviously. That's 36%. We don't demur from that. So 45% is the percentage offer. I would always look at the percentage rather than the numbers, and how those numbers in the context of the past delivery of 5. 21 may not be hundreds, but we need to make a start here, and we need to address the need, and it will make a significant difference to those people housed as a consequence, should this appeal be successful.
Okay, thank you. On your table 2.4, you adopted Sedgefield. So perhaps a bit more background on Sedgefield as opposed to Liverpool, please.
Yeah, so this is set out within my proof of evidence in terms of reference to another appeal where I gave evidence, which was the Aviation Lane appeal. And this is in section 7 of my proof of evidence, starting at 7.5, paragraph 7.5 on page 27. So the context of Sedgefield is, in my view, that the backlog of affordable housing should be dealt with as quickly as possible. Sedgefield is typically aligned to the removal of backlog in a housing land supply scenario. And my view that is if it's appropriate to deal with backlog of market housing within the first 5 years, then arguably those in need of affordable housing have perhaps a greater need and should be dealt with as quickly as possible. So the aviation lane appeal decision CD 124 and paragraph paragraph 8 of that decision, as this is set out at the bottom of page 27 of my evidence, says that in my view the extent of the shortfall, so we've got 2,400 odd here, and the number of households on the council's housing register over 2,000, and the numbers on the shared ownership Help to Buy register combined to demonstrate a significant pressing need for affordable housing now. As such, I consider that the aim should be to meet the affordable housing as soon as possible. So the 860 is not, it's not a realistic figure, but it shows us the position if that backlog was to be removed. And in my mind, it shows the sheer extent of how much of a step change in the delivery of affordable housing is needed here to enable as many people as possible to be housed in affordable housing. It's in that context that I refer to the Sedgefield approach.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I mean, what would the council really like to raise or to talk about following that presentation?
Following that presentation, we don't disagree with any of the figures at all. We agree with the extent of the backlog. And in principle with the approach of attempting to deliver the shortfall of affordable housing within 5 years. The only matter I would raise, as was already raised earlier, is a relatively small affordable housing contributions, 21 units in total. And the tenure and the mix of the units is also very linked to market forces. We're talking 5 first homes, 15 at 80% market rents, and 1 shared ownership unit. So the nature of the affordable housing being supplied will only meet the upper end of the division between need for affordable housing and the ability to access market housing, particularly given it's a relatively expensive area.
Okay, yes, that last point is I think is interesting. Yeah, so the split within the affordable housing I think is important. So just to understand a bit more about that from you, Mr. Stacey.
Yes, so I mean the split is agreed and it's part of the sexual license agreement, so it's not in dispute between the parties. So it is 15 units of affordable rented units at 80% of the market, 1 shared ownership unit, 5 first homes, as we've heard. There's nothing in the policy that requires a split of that nature, and there's nothing in the or the MPPF that seems to preference one type of affordable housing over another. In terms of 15 of the 21 being rented, that is a substantial proportion of those being geared towards those on the council's housing register. And I say that that's a significant part of this scheme, a significant benefit of the mix that's proposed.
Okay, would you like to add anything more on that point?
No, I don't have anything more to add.
Okay, thank you. And it's just this point. Maybe it's not saying. I suppose it's really just for me to make a decision on, but there's just this point about the how much influence on weight does the number of units have, and I suppose linked to the importance of the units given the situation of the current agreed affordable housing backlog of 2,400 or something units. But I think I would maybe just as like a just to note this now, it'd be helpful to have in closing just the positions from both sides, and that was specific points
about that. Yes, sir.
So I'm just checking whether there's an appeal decision for you that talks about policy compliance levels and affordable housing.
So if I'm just being completely honest here, I always struggle slightly with the concept of how much to apply to the weight of the total number of units.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, even 2 units is still 2 units that's meeting a demand.
That's why I was trying to help with an appeal decision.
Okay, sir.
But at the same time, clearly, if there's 1,000 units, that's clearly better than one. So it's just working out how to find that balance.
Of course, we'll certainly say something about it in closing. So I think for us, it's probably the starting point for any of these sorts of discussions has to be what the extent of the shortfall is. Because if the extent of the shortfall is only, not an affordable housing, but just in general, whatever the need is that a scheme seeking to meet, it's only a marginal shortfall, then of course, you can afford, if you like, if you're from the local authority can afford to be a bit choosy and say, oh, well, the benefits of providing X or Y might not be so great in a particular location. I think it probably logically flows from that. I think that's what we'll be saying is that if you decide that the shortfall is vast and, and if we say that it is, it's on a very, very high level indeed. Then yeah, the weight that you attribute to a benefit has to flow from that. The scale of the benefit, might change if you're providing thousands of homes or whatever. But when you look at the delivery figures that are agreed with the Statement of Common Ground, 21 affordable homes it's not nothing compared to what this authority has been delivering on an annual basis. But we'll certainly say more about it, sir, in closings.
So if I could just draw your attention to core document 137, which is an appeal decision at Colpit Heath in South Gloucestershire. Paragraph 62. Sorry, paragraph 61. Sorry.
Okay.
This is on page 13. It says, paragraph 60 talks about the contribution that the housing can make in housing land supply shortfall, and then 61 goes on to say it's accordingly we give a substantial weight in the carriage balance. It goes on to say there are 3 different components of housing that will be delivered: market housing, affordable housing, and custom built housing. They are all important and substantial matters that should be attached to each component. For the reasons raised in evidence by the appellants, which was not substantially challenged by council, albeit they all form part of the overall housing requirements supplied. The fact that much needed affordable housing and custom built housing are elements that are no more than required by policy is irrelevant. They would still comprise a significant social benefit and substantial weight in that case. So that's in relation to a policy compliance situation. You see our offer as an enhanced offer of that. Goes some way towards the very substantial tag. That's what we're suggesting is appropriate in this case.
Okay, thank you. Anything else from the council?
Sorry, just trying to agree with Sinas. We do not disagree with the fact that substantial weight should be attributed to the lack of affordable housing. And as indicated in the report that was just said, the inspector attached substantial weight, which is what the council is also asking to be attached to the lack of delivery. And I think as pointed by my colleague earlier on, in as much as we did agree to affordable rents being 15 of the proposed units, given the position we find ourselves in, not having a local policy, our evidence does indicate that the units being proposed would be relatively affordable, because the preference of the council would have been for those units to be delivered as social rent rather than affordable rent, because that would it would indicate more likely to what the council needs at the moment. But we found ourselves in a position that we found ourselves in, and we acknowledge that.
Okay, thank you. Stacey, do you have anything to say about that? Yeah.
substantial in the appeal decision I read out was in respect to policy compliant. So that's not comparable to the situation here. And in terms of the social rent, I touched on the fact that there's no requirement in policy to require that. There's an appeal decision. I don't know, again, feel that would specifically it's not the evidence we can present it. It says that pretty much the same thing, that there's no ranking of one form of affordable housing tenure over another. We are providing affordable housing. Assessment policy. And finally, the affordable rent position was agreed.
If you want any weight to apply to that decision, obviously you need to add that to the to that Ealing one that you just referenced to the.
It's a short route. I mean,
I've got it here, but
in some ways you might think, I don't know whether we really need an appeal decision to make the point that the unless the council's able to point to policy or guidance that elevates one tenure of affordable over another, then our position is that there isn't such a sort of ranking, and we've agreed a mix with the council. All of that's agreed, not just in the 106, it's also agreed in the addendum statement of common ground. Yeah, I know I was there. I was there. Yeah, so I don't. It's a different. I mean, it's an Ealing case. It's West London. I mean, you're getting into London affordable rent, so it's maybe slightly. The point is that there isn't some sort of intrinsic hierarchy. Affordable housing means affordable housing. You've got to provide an acceptable mix and tenure of affordable housing. We've done that, and we know that that's so because of the statement of common ground. So it's not really a point that's really between the parties.
Okay. Anything from the council?
The other thing we would add regarding the substantial weight to be applied to policy compliant, we'd only consider that to apply to be 30% of the affordable housing, which would be policy compliant, therefore giving us the 15%, which has been provided in excess of policy requirement, potentially very substantial weight.
So you would, sorry, I thought I was going to be changing position then, but it is, but
it's in our direction.
The appellant.
Yeah,
there's no need to. Okay,
in the direction.
That's fine.
Very substantial excess of policy and just substantial in inverted commas for the first whatever percentage of policy is. I can't remember the top of my head.
30%.
Yeah,
30%.
Okay, so I don't think I've expressed it in that way, but I would agree. If this was just a policy compliance scheme, I probably would be a substantial weight, but we're not. So I think my position is that it's very substantial anyway.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, anything else?
I'm really sorry to do. Would it be possible to get the names of the two? I'm so sorry I didn't write it down when you introduced yourselves earlier on. It's absolutely my error. Would you mind?
So Lisa Richardson.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
Adela Pilgrim.
That's what I said. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. There could be problems here with affordable housing delivery, but I have seen worse. I remember in 2019, Bromley was at -4 for the previous year.
It's Bromley, so yeah. Yeah, huge rise minus. There are some minus figures on that. The -85 in 2016-17, -68 in 15-16. If you have regard to right to buy.
Okay, thank you. So I think now we're moving on to the appellant's witnesses.
Yes. Well, if you're happy to just press on, we'll be getting, what is it, half an hour or so? So yeah, I'll just take a minute or so for Mr. Crawford to sort himself out. You say when you're ready, Mr. Crawl, when you've got all your bits ready to go. Okay. So, right, microphone on. Are you ready, sir? Thank you. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Crawford. You've produced a proof of evidence for the inquiry, so we probably want to have that to hand. And you've got a figure towards the end of that, which we've seen already, and a number of appendices as well. All within the same. It's all within the same PDF. Have you got that, sir?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I will introduce you first to the inquiry with reference to page 9, PDF page 12 of your proof of evidence, section 2, where you tell us that you are a chartered landscape architect. You're a director of LDA design. You started, as you tell us, as a solicitor. Heavens help us. But you changed. Good idea. You changed to landscape architecture, left the law behind, and you were awarded a diploma in landscape architecture. And you got qualifications as a chartered landscape architect, and indeed now you're since 1999 you've been a full member of the Landscape Institute. Yes. So when it comes to documents that we might touch on in a few minutes, Glivia and all the rest of it, what sort of levels of familiarity have you got with documents like that?
Oh, extremely familiar. Used it on many projects for many years.
Right then, let's start off before we get into questions of. We're going to do character and appearance first in a minute, and then I'll ask you questions about greenbelt openness and then greenbelt purposes. So that's what's on the menu. But before we do all that stuff, just a couple of points of clarification, please. The first one was about numbers. So in your proof, going right into the bit on greenbelt openness, that's on page 33. If you just get to that bit.
Yes.
There's a heading greenbelt openness, and you deal first with the spatial component of greenbelt openness towards the bottom of page 33.
Yes.
And you set out at the top of page 34 some calculations as to what the existing footprint is, what the proposed footprint is, existing volume is, proposed volume, and then you set out what the increases are. Can you help us, I suppose, first, can you help us with how those numbers were derived? Can you also give what the inspector, I think, was after, which is percentages expressed as what the percentage increase would be, rather than what you've said at 7.2.3, which is how much of what's proposed is already there?
Yeah, certainly. Yes, so those numbers were derived from 2 drawings, which are in Appendix 4 to my proof. You looked at the one drawing shows the existing buildings on the site and the other shows the proposed. You were looking at the existing yesterday. So they were prepared by Blue Pencil Designs, who I think dealt with the design of the scheme. And in each case, the drawings show identify the buildings that are within the green belt, and for each building state its footprint and its volume. So the figures that I've got on page 34 are taken from those drawings.
Thank you very much. And then if you could explain, as I say, if you were to add in percentages for what the percentage increase is, what are those numbers?
Yes, certainly. So in terms of footprint, the increase that's the 1139, represents an 80% increase on the existing.
Okay.
And for volume, the increase is 124% over the existing.
Thank you.
Exactly. So thank you very much. And I think, and the 56% and the 45% as you set out, 7.2.3, those are still
correct. So
they're all just mathematical ways of
they're
saying
the
the same thing.
inverse of each other.
Fine.
Talking in round terms,
yeah,
the existing quantum represents about half of the proposed quantum. So the figures I've just given you as increases over what's there,
yeah,
effectively
double what's
confirm
there.
it that the proposed is roughly double what's already there.
Gotcha. Okay. You wanted, I think, to come back to references in your proof where you say well over half,
Yes.
rather than approximately half. You say approximately half at let's see, at 7.2.3, third line down.
That's
elsewhere
correct.
in your proof, you use the phrase well over half. Could you just give the inspector the clarification as to what's happening there?
Yeah, indeed. So, while during the period when I was drafting my proof, I was working off earlier iterations of those two drawings I've referred to. Over literally the last couple of days before exchange of proofs, it was actually as the addendum statement of common ground emerged, which contains a plan showing the extent of site within the green belt that is much more accurate than what Blue Pencil were previously working off. They were previously working, as I understand it, from the local plan proposals map, which is a very small scale, and it's therefore quite hard to tell exactly where the green belt boundary falls. So when they got the new plan, they updated these drawings, and what it shows is that a number of existing buildings which we had all assumed to be within the green belt are actually not within the green belt. So if you look at the plan of existing buildings, sorry, if you forgive me, I sort of pointed out there's a row of buildings along that sort of northeastern boundary of the site.
Yes, there's a strip of land that's not in the green belt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they were previously measured in,
Right.
And
then they were
therefore had to be
excluded.
amended at the last minute. So when I don't have the figures to hand anymore, but when I was drafting my proof, those percentages, which now appear as 56% and 45%, from memory, one was about 60 and one was about 70. So I then used the language that it was well over half. Now, as I recall, I got the final versions of the drawings on the afternoon of the deadline for submission. I amended this paragraph, but I realised subsequently that I overlooked amending references where I'd used the similar wording, well over half. So if I could give you those, there are three paragraph numbers, and just ask you simply to effectively make that amendment. So it's 1.2.13, which is in my summary. 7.5.2, and 9.2.1.
Okay.
So all three of those currently say well over half, and they should say approximately half.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So the figures that we've got now are the right ones in terms of if we only include those buildings which are definitely within the green belt. You've given us the figures. Okay. Thank you very much. That's it in terms of that table. The next thing I wanted to ask you about before we get into the detail, again, of character and appearance, etc., it was a question really about methodology. Could you explain what you've done? Could you explain while you're giving that explanation, can you tell us the extent to which it accords with best practice, industry guidance and the rest of it? And I'd also like you to contrast what has been done by you to what you understand has been done by those against you and for the local authority.
Certainly. So starting from character and appearance, the way that harm to character and appearance is formally assessed is by means of a landscape and visual impact assessment, an LVIA. There was one that was submitted with the application. That followed the nationally prescribed guidance, which you're familiar with, so I know Glavia 3 for short. I then, in preparing my evidence, I reviewed the LVIA, and as you'll have seen in my proof, sort of throughout my proof, I said where I agreed with it, and in areas where I didn't agree, or I think there was an area which I felt it covered sufficiently. I presented my own assessment, again, compliant with the Glavia 3 prescribed methodology. And to be consistent, I mean, inevitably each practice interprets Glavia 3 in slightly its own way. To minimize the risk of confusion, I, in making my own assessment, I followed the broad methodological approach used in the LVIA. So I wasn't I used their terminology and so on, rather than kind of adding to confusion by introducing my own. So that deals with character and appearance. For the Greenbelt assessment, I set out in my proof, section 5, the methodology that I was using for the assessment. It's sort of broadly structured in the same way that a Glavia assessment would be. It assesses the baseline and then assesses how that baseline would change were the development to go ahead. And particularly within that, I set out a scale of harm at paragraph 5.3.5, where I defined harm ranging from major at the top end of the scale through moderate, minor, negligible, and explained the criteria I used in applying that terminology. So I feel that that's for sort of both character and appearance and Greenbelt gives hopefully quite a clear and transparent assessment where you can follow through my reasoning, the factors I've taken into account, the conclusions I've reached. I have to say, in relation to the council's witnesses, I can't see that either of them have done anything equivalent to that. Neither of them sets out a methodology, neither of them defines a scale of harm. In many instances, I feel within either their proofs or their oral evidence, they have really explained the basis on which they arrived at their judgments and conclusions. So it's, you know, I want to blow my own trumpet, but I sort of feel that my assessments are robust, and I'm less convinced that those presented by the council are.
Why is it important to be transparent about things like methodology and the way that we get to the conclusions that we do, so far as Glavia style assessments are concerned?
Well, so it enables, when assessments are being scrutinised in a forum like this, either through examination or indeed through the inspector in arriving at his conclusions, there is a clear line and logic of reasoning which is based on verifiable facts and things that can be observed on site, that you can follow a rationale through to the conclusion they arrive at. In the absence of that, you're effectively left with an expert saying, this is my opinion, trust me, I know what I'm doing, but you haven't got the basis for understanding how they arrived at that judgment.
Okay, thank you very much. Now that's all I wanted to ask you about by way of setting the scene. We turn then to first two issues of character and appearance, and I'll ask you in a moment to come to what the effects are that you see, both, well, first from a visual point of view, and then latterly from a landscape character point of view. But before we get to that, could I ask you to give the inspector the headlines of your analysis of the baseline, the site as it exists today, and what you consider to be its most important characteristics?
I'll start with the context, if I can. It's important to set the site within its context. So the site obviously lies to the south of Great Burstead or Billericay. The rural landscape extends southwards from the settlement edge. Medium to large scale arable fields, a sort of gently undulating topography, variable field boundaries. In some places there are quite strong, substantial hedgerows with hedgerow trees. In other places, those hedgerows are quite diminished and weak, and in many places they've been removed altogether. And the evidence-based documents that we've looked at, they refer to that as one of the characteristics of the area. There are a number of public footpaths that run through that landscape. As they go up onto the higher ground in particular, there are quite extensive views. Elsewhere, where they're more contained by topography or by vegetation, naturally the views are less extensive. Where there are extensive views, you sort of see beyond that immediate agricultural landscape, and the presence of development in the wider landscape is very apparent. Specifically, the existing built edge of Billericay is very visible throughout much of that area. So we're talking of the houses on the south side of Mill Road, which has already been mentioned. Mill Road, as it extends west, I think becomes Church Street. So there are all the way along that boundaries, there are houses that back onto the site. So you see the rear gardens and the houses. You've also got the row of houses on South End Road, immediately east of the site, including Maitland Lodge. There is an area of commercial development on the opposite side of South End Road. And looking further to the south, you can see a few buildings in Basildon, certainly from certain places. What you also see is a lot of traffic on South End Road itself as quite a busy road. So it's by no means a sort of undisturbed, tranquil rural landscape. It's countryside in which one is sort of very aware of the proximity of a settlement. Mm-hmm. The site itself is actually quite different in some respects. Firstly, it's a parcel of land that is of a much smaller scale than those medium-large agricultural fields. It's in a different land use. It's not agricultural, it's equestrian. And equestrian land uses are very often associated with edge of settlement, the peri-urban area. So whilst you can get them in sort of more rural settings, they're quite often sort of indicative of an edge of settlement location. You've got the rear gardens and the houses on Mill Road and South End Road, obviously immediately abutting the south boundary, so you have a greater sense of their influence. And also the site is sort of physically quite separate from the wider landscape because of the strong vegetation, particularly on the western and southern boundaries, which has been much discussed over the last day or two. So it gives the site quite a high degree of containment, which means that views both from the site to the wider landscape and from the wider landscape into the site are quite restricted. And then, of course, we've got quite a significant amount of existing buildings within the site, whereas the wider landscape, that area to the south, is whilst you see buildings in the sort of wider surrounds of it, that agricultural landscape essentially lacks buildings. So there's quite a marked distinction between the character of the site and of the wider landscape.
In terms of the quality of the site, its value, something you've looked at.
Indeed.
It's not, we agree, a site that's subject to any designations for landscape quality or whatever. We've been over that with
Nor is the
Ms.
wider
Bevan.
landscape.
And it's not a valued landscape, quote unquote, within the meaning of the framework. We're agreed with the council on that much.
Yep.
I asked some questions to Ms. Bevan about what, if anything, the Greenbelt designation tells us about the quality of the site's landscape, its character, etc. Do you have a take on that issue, the relevance or not of Greenbelt designation to discussions about landscape quality and character and value?
Yes, certainly. Well, the NPPF tells us that the fundamental aim of Greenbelt is to prevent urban sprawl by keeping land permanently open. So what it means is that Greenbelt is essentially about the extent of settlements and about controlling their growth. And it's about the role of the landscape around and between settlements in doing that. And that landscape is what the Greenbelt is. It signifies nothing about the quality or the character of the landscape. You can have areas of landscape within the Greenbelt that are very high quality. For example, part of the Greenbelt west of London is in the Chilterns AONB. But equally, you can have areas of Greenbelt landscapes that are very poor quality, very unattractive. And on the other side of that coin, there are many, many towns and cities throughout the country that don't have greenbelts. But of course, some of them have very attractive landscape around them. So there's no relationship between the presence or absence of a greenbelt designation and the quality or character of the landscape.
Ms. Bevan's view on the sensitivity of the landscape to development. Do you remember I asked lots of questions about sensitivity? She refers to it being a sensitive area in her proof of evidence. Do you remember that was the basis of a number of questions. I think in the end where we ended up is she thought medium sensitivity for the site itself. So she told us yesterday. Just to be absolutely clear, where are you at? To what extent do you depart from her on that, if at all, and if so, why?
So I've assessed the sensitivity of the site itself as being low. That's paragraph 8.2.5 of my proof. And in terms of the wider, what I've called the assessment parcel, the wider landscape that I consider is relevant to the assessment of this development. I also assess the sensitivity of that wider parcel as low. That's in the section that leads up to my paragraph 8.2.15. So there's and there's quite a sort of extended methodology that informs that assessment. It's the methodology spelled out in the LVIA, which, as I said, is Glavia compliant, and I've followed it, that takes account of various different criteria, each of which are assessed in their turn, and then they're combined to give the overall assessments of sensitivity.
So if you
we're at low,
go on.
We're at low for both the site and the wider landscape.
If you as a landscape professional, or indeed if the inspector wants to get your fingernails under the approach taken by Ms. Bevan when she says the area is sensitive, to understand what area, how sensitive, and how she's gone about reaching that judgment, are you able to do that? How would you go about trying to do that?
Well, it's very difficult. Within her proof, she doesn't explain how she arrives at that, describing it as a sensitive area. You asked her about it in cross-examination. She said she'd taken account of a similar range of considerations as in the LVIA methodology, but she didn't explain either there or in her proof how she's taken account of them, how she's applied them, how she's assessed them, and how they feed through into that conclusion that it's a sensitive area.
Right. Any more about the existing baseline? Because after that, I'm going to ask you about first visual effects and then landscape effects.
I think it would be helpful to sort of walk our way through the viewpoints in the LVIA.
Absolutely, yes.
So maybe we do that as part of
the visual effect. Well, should we use those as proxies for the key visual receptors?
Yeah.
Try and do two birds with one stone. So if we turn next to visual effects, so we've done baseline, visual effects. And as you say, visual effects can often be analysed helpfully with reference to viewpoints, standing in as proxies for important visual receptors or people. Where would you like to take us to give us your sense of your headline conclusions on the key visual effects?
Yes, certainly. So if I can sort of ask you to have several things open simultaneously. My figure 1 at the back of my proof shows the locations of the LVIA viewpoints.
Yes.
It also shows the public footpath network in the area, which I think is quite helpful. Then the viewpoints themselves are in the LVIA, for which I was sure I had the reference. Yes, CD 103, and they're at page 56 onwards.
Okay, so we've got the map at the end of your proof, your figure, and then we've got the images themselves, which appear from page 56 of the LVIA.
That's right. Do you have them, sir?
Yes, I do now. Thank you.
Take it away.
Okay, well, I might as well work through them in numerical order, I suppose. So this first one, as you'll see from my figure 1, is located some distance west of the site. It's on the public footpath, which is adjacent to but outside the cemetery. So it looks east towards the site. And what we see in the midground, quite a lot of vegetation and a few buildings. That's the area around Grange Farm, which sort of sits between our site and the viewpoint, and actually obscures any visibility of the site. So the LVI says, and I agree, that there is no visual impact here. What I would point out, as you look sort of more towards the left-hand half of the photo, is the very clearly visible housing, which is housing on the south side of Mill Road and Church Street. The next one is also from the west, but is much closer to the site. So it's sort of on to the east of Grange Farm, only one field away from the site boundary. So we have a clear view across the field to that row of trees, which are on the western site boundary. So that's a boundary that has a strong hedgerow and a lot of trees. And as you can see, even in this winter view with no foliage, the site is fairly well screened in this view. But again, you can see to the left the housing on Mill Road, and to the right of the site through that sort of gap, you can see the larger buildings which are part of that commercial area on the east side of Southend Road. And actually, sir, I'll suggest that you walk this footpath on your site visit, and as you walk down to this from the north, you actually see several more of those larger scale commercial buildings. So it's this point about the urban influence of the edge of the settlement on the landscape, the very clear perception that you are close to a significant settlement. You are not sort of in the deepest countryside where there are no urban influences, but also you can see from here the effect that the existing boundary vegetation would have in screening the development. And of course, it would be all the stronger in the summer when the foliage is on the trees. Moving on to viewpoint 3. This one is located on Mill Road, sort of immediately north of the site. So there is a glimpse through a gap between the houses where the arrow says approximate location of site. from this locate one. Am I right to move into effects?
Oh, certainly. Yes,
Sorry,
please do.
I should have done that on
Please do.
2.2. We better go back to 2 then.
You did effects for one.
I did.
Negligible, as it says.
Yes, yeah.
Viewpoint 2, the conclusion on the viewpoint 2 on the LVIA is major, moderate, a combination of high sensitivity for our users and medium magnitude of change. Do you have anything to say on
Well, yes, I mean, in my judgment, that overestimates it. I think given the degree of that screening vegetation on the site boundary, I assess it as a small magnitude, which when you combine that with high sensitivity, highly sensitive rights of way users gives you a moderate significance. So I'm a notch down from the LVIA.
Thank you.
But actually, there is then the question of that is the degree of the effect, if you like.
Yes.
But there's the separate question of what I've called the valency. Is it positive, negative, or neutral?
Yes. What do you say about that?
I say that this is a neutral effect. Given the context where there is already a lot of highly visible housing on the settlement edge, yes, our development will add more housing, which will to a degree be visible through this filtered vegetation. But that overall, you wouldn't say that makes the view either better or worse. It's just a bit different. So being neither better nor worse, I say it's a neutral effect.
Thank you.
So
we're on then, I think, viewpoint 3, weren't we?
Yes.
So you described what viewpoint 3 shows us. I think then perhaps you were about to turn on to the effects so far as viewpoint 3 goes.
So when you get to effects, from here and from a few other locations towards this end of Mill Road, you are likely to get glimpses of rooftops within the development, but you're seeing them obviously within a context that is already dominated by the existing built form, the existing housing on Mill Road. So I say that has, and again, this is applying the criteria in the LVIA methodology, a very small magnitude of effect. Again, high sensitivity receptors, pedestrians, residents, but given a very small magnitude, we get a minor effect. And again, I say it's neutral.
Okay.
It changes the view, it doesn't make it worse.
That is viewpoint 3. Viewpoint 4 then.
Viewpoint 4. So viewpoint 4 is on the on South End Road, the A129. It says about a quarter of a kilometre, so 200 or 300 metres south of the site. So we're looking north towards Billericay, with the site as indicated to the left of the view. The existing housing on the settlement edge, again visible sort of both to the right and left of where that arrow is, and also this commercial development visible to the right of the road. Important point to make here in terms of who are the receptors for this view. This, as you can see, there's no footpath beside the road. It's a busy road.
Yes.
So the only people who are going to experience this are likely to be motorists. So we're not talking about pedestrians. And motorists are regarded as a receptor as having a medium sensitivity rather than a high sensitivity. They tend to be more focused on the journey. They're traveling at speed. They have less time to take things in within the view, and therefore the sensitivity is a little lower. Now, the LVIA assesses a very small magnitude. I actually think that understates it. My assessment is a medium magnitude during construction and at year 1, because I think through the boundary vegetation on the southern boundary and above the hedgerow, there will be a certain amount is visible. You'll be seeing it in the context of the existing, but nevertheless, it will be quite visible. But over time, as the new trees on the southern boundary mature, so by year 15, where we assess the longer term effects, I have that magnitude reducing from medium to small. So in terms of significance with medium sensitivity road users, I've got a moderate effect during construction at year 1, and a moderate minor effect at year 15. And again, they're neutral.
Thanks very much. Right, so that's four.
That's
two
four.
more.
Number 5 is also close to the A129. It's a few hundred metres further south. It is actually on a public footpath, as you can see from my figure 1, where it is a public footpath just to the west of the A129. So we're back on a public footpath, so our receptors are at high sensitivity again. I have a small magnitude during construction in year 1, reducing to very small at year 15, which gives a moderate significance at construction year 1, reducing to minor at year 15. And again, for the same reasons, the existing visible development, it's a neutral effect. And then finally, so number 6. So this is much closer to the site, but to the east or northeast. So it's on the opposite side of Southend Road. We're looking at the right. Those houses, if they're not on Mill Road, they're on the smaller streets just close to it. And then the left half, we're looking at those houses on Southend Road that front the road, including Maitland Lodge. So from here, there will be rooftops of the development visible above some of those rooftops. So it's a public footpath, so receptors of high sensitivity. But I agree with the LVIA's assessment of a very small magnitude, giving a minor significance, and again, neutral.
Thank you very much. I think that's all of them, isn't it? That's the 6. So taking a step back then, reflecting on what those tell us about the extent of visual effects on the arising from the development. We'll come to landscape character in just a minute. Are there any adverse effects that you identify, and if so, how significant are they?
We're just sort of wrapping it up and then answering that question. So what they tell us is that seen from the north and east, which is where we are within the existing settlement, or sort of looking from Southend Road, we have minimal effects. Not quite nothing. You get a few viewpoints, but minimal. In the rural landscape, there will be effects within a few hundred meters to the south or the west, so that's viewpoints 2, 4, and 5, but they are neutral, so therefore they don't amount to harm. In terms of the planning balance, harm is going to be adverse effects, and these are not adverse effects. And then viewpoint 1 shows us, and it's representative of longer distance views within the landscape, and although that's to the west, it would similarly apply to the south. That you get no intervisibility and therefore no effects at greater distance.
Thank you very much. Can we turn then to landscape effects? So we've done baseline, we've done visual effects, landscape effects. Could you explain how you have approached that question, and what your overall conclusion on it is?
Yes, certainly. So it's as with the other aspects of LVIA, it's about assessing the sensitivity of the baseline and then the magnitude of change that will arise and would arise by virtue of the development. So we've talked about the sensitivity assessment a few minutes ago. In assessing the magnitude of change, again, I've followed the LVIA methodology, and I've assessed effects. So it's what we're assessing is effects on the character of the landscape, and I've assessed them both in terms of the appeal site itself and in terms of the wider landscape. And so in relation to the appeal site, I conclude there's a medium magnitude of change. And with the low sensitivity of the landscape, that gives an effect of moderate minor significance. And in terms of the valency, I find that is an adverse effect. although it is finely balanced, I would say. If you consider the existing buildings in the western half of the site, I think even their owner would say they're not a beautiful set of buildings. They're, they vary in type, condition, materials. They seem to have been added on a somewhat piecemeal, unplanned basis. In my judgment, the well-designed housing that is proposed on that part of the site would actually represent an improvement over the existing in terms of the character. But on the other hand, development within the paddocks,
Yes.
Would clearly be an adverse effect. So balance the two, it's finely balanced, but I say adverse.
And so overall, and I think that this is all explained at pages 48 and 49 of your proof, you go into that balance.
Yeah.
You end up, so far as the site itself goes, bottom of page 49, there's a moderate minor adverse effect on the landscape character during construction, and indeed at years 1 and year 15.
Yes. So although there is planting proposed within the development, as that planting matures, it will soften the streets and so on. That is not going to change that significant change in the character. So therefore, the degree of adverse effect, in my view, won't reduce by year 15.
Let's turn then to the wider landscape. And you summarise, just for the inspector's note, this is top of page 50 of your proof, where you deal with that. What do you say about the landscape effect so far as the wider landscape goes, your assessment parcel that you identify in your figure?
Yeah, well, we're not talking of a particularly major change to the character of that wider parcel. I've described the character, and I've particularly described the way it is already influenced by the proximity of the settlement edge. So whilst development on the site would to a degree be perceived or visible within that wider landscape, albeit well contained and quite heavily screened as we've described, that wouldn't significantly change the characteristics of the landscape. We can already see the edge of Billericay. So I therefore identify a small magnitude of change. Combining that again with the low sensitivity of the landscape gives a negligible significance of effect.
Right, thank you very much. So we've been through the character and appearance case, both in terms of baseline and visual effects, and then also in terms of landscape effects as well. Yeah. Let us turn then away from character and appearance to the other component of your evidence, which is to say greenbelt. And you present evidence both on greenbelt openness and then also on greenbelt purposes too.
Yes.
So we've heard lots about greenbelt openness over the last day and a half or so. It will be inevitably one of the very most important issues that the inspector's got to decide now, is the extent of harm that there is to greenbelt openness. So could you walk the inspector through what you say about this, and whether or not the council's right, so I say the council, whether or not Mrs. Cook's right to say that the level of harm to openness will be substantial, which is in the end, I think, what it all comes down to.
Yeah. So for reference, I address this pages 33 to 35, 36 of my proof. So I've looked at it in terms of the various aspects of openness as set out in planning practice guidance. And I've also looked at it both in terms of the site itself and in terms of the wider area. The wider landscape, let's be clear, the adjoining greenbelt that lies beyond the site boundary. It's perhaps worth just explaining that. Any new development or new quantum of development within the greenbelt is clearly going to have a direct effect on the openness of the site in which it takes place.
Yeah.
It may or may not have an effect on how openness is perceived beyond the site boundary within the wider greenbelt. So, for example, if you had a site that was so well contained and so well screened that from the wider greenbelt you were unaware of this development taking place, it would not change your perception of the openness of that wider greenbelt. On the other hand, if you could very clearly see it, hear it, observe the development, you would perceive that you were in the greenbelt, you were then close or adjacent to this new development. So the proximity of development would change your perception of the openness of the wider greenbelt. So hence looking at it from sort of both perspectives.
Yes.
So in terms of the spatial perspective, and that in itself applies only within the site. There is no spatial change within the wider greenbelt. And this is where we get to the numbers we were looking at. The situation is very different from if we were looking at a site that was completely undeveloped and we were putting 47 dwellings into it. This is a site that already has, as we discussed, a significant amount of existing buildings, roughly half of what is proposed. So whilst there is a significant increase in the quantum of development, it's not an absolute transformation from no development to this quantum of development. There are also, as well as the buildings, which these figures relate to, there are also all associated bits and pieces of fences, boundary walls, street furniture, etc. And it's fair to say that there are, in the existing situation, there is also quite a lot of associated paraphernalia, if you like. There are quite a lot of there are plenty of fences and gates within the site. Some of those are actually metal sheeting, so they have quite a significant sort of visual dimension to them. There are quite a lot of stored materials, equipment, caravans, parked vehicles, etc. And of course, within a residential development, you get boundary walls, boundary fences, you get vehicles, you get play equipment in back gardens. So there are those matters, but I don't have any measurements for the existing. We don't have any for the proposed, but I've taken account of that within my consideration.
Where do we get to then overall?
Overall, taking account of that and the visual aspects, which apply particularly to the wider area, degree of activity, etc., I conclude a moderate loss of openness within the site itself. So using the sort of scale and harm that I set out, that means that there's a noticeable change, a readily apparent change to the baseline, but it's not a fundamental change. It's not going from no development to 47 houses.
Yeah.
And then within the wider landscape, given the context I've already described, where it is already influenced by development, there is already that affects the existing perception of openness. So I conclude a negligible change to the perception of openness within the wider landscape.
So moderate for the site itself, negligible for the wider assessment.
Yeah,
negligible for the wider assessment parcel.
Yes.
And then just before we leave this topic of openness, then what have you got to say about Mrs. Cook's case? I mean, you've heard what she said today and yesterday as well about this idea of, it's not only is it, more than moderate, not only is it, more than, I don't know, significant or whatever, it's substantial. And what's your understanding of how that conclusion was reached, and what's your reaction to it?
Well, I guess I can't fully understand how she's reached that conclusion. She agreed, I think, in cross-examination that substantial sits right at the top of the scale of harm, above moderate and limited and significant, right at the top. So given that we are, as I've said, starting from a site that already has a significant quantum of development, we're doubling it, but that's not an absolute change. You know, the way I expressed it in my proof, half of what is proposed is already there. Given the other existing influences that affect the perception of openness, I find it very hard to say that that degree of change to openness is right at the top end of the scale. You know, if that is substantial at the highest end of the scale, then what would it be if you were in an untouched rural landscape with no existing development, nothing, no sort of influences that diminish the existing openness, and then you put the same quantum of development in? You know, you've sort of fallen off the top of the scale. So,
Yeah.
to my mind, we can't be close to the top of the scale. My formal assessment has arrived at moderate on site and negligible in the wider area. That clearly isn't right at the top of the scale. So I can only disagree with Mrs. Cook's conclusion on that.
Let's turn away from openness then to greenbelt purposes. But now there are two that I need to ask you about, because there are two that are in dispute. The first one then is purpose. Well, purpose B. You deal with these, I should say, from page 30 onwards, 30 onwards in your proof of evidence. The first is purpose B, and that's the one about towns merging.
Yes.
Obviously, the inspector's got lots of questions on this today. He's seen your figure that shows what the situation is, and I asked heavens knows how many questions about it today. So I think the parameters of the debate are probably pretty well understood. What's your take then in the end on the extent to which there would be harm, if at all, and if so, how much harm associated with this purpose of towns merging?
Well, my conclusion is no harm, no conflict with this purpose. If we look at it purely in terms of are we physically, measurably on a map reducing the distance between Billericay and Basildon, we're not. Because the existing housing on Southend Road extends further south than the site boundary. So that would remain the closest spot. But I think it is also important to look at it in terms of what is the perception of the separation between the settlements. And given that, as you discussed with Mrs. Cook, there is a very extensive area of rural landscape, of predominantly agricultural landscape, that is what separates the settlements, and that will remain untouched and unaffected. This development is in a small self-contained parcel which doesn't form part of that agricultural landscape, tucked in the corner, in an area where you can already, you have a strong awareness of the edge of Billericay already. Then my view is that it will make no change to the perception of separation, as well as the actual sort of measurable distance of separation.
Thank you very much. Righto, that's the first of the purposes. The second of the purposes to discuss is purpose C, which is the one about protecting the countryside from encroachment. Again, you deal with this in a couple of places in your proof, or both on page 31, which is where you consider, I think, the baseline situation, in your section 6, page 31, so far as that purpose goes. And then you consider effects on page 36, so far as, again, that this purpose goes, countryside encroachment. So we know what the purpose is. We know all about the site now. The inspector's heard lots and lots of evidence about its character and appearance. What level of harm do you identify in relation to this question of encroaching into the countryside?
Mm-hmm. I've talked about those existing urbanizing influences, those influences that reduce the perception of openness. And in the same way, they represent a degree of encroachment on the countryside at present. It gives it the character of countryside that is close to the edge of a settlement, as opposed to deeply rural and undisturbed. So on a baseline of significant existing encroachment, and within that, as seen within that wider landscape, as I've described previously, the addition of this development would not change that perception of the existing encroachment on the wider landscape. However, within the site itself, by definition, land that is currently defined as countryside would be developed, so that definition amounts to a degree of encroachment. So putting those two together, I conclude there will be minor harm in terms of conflict with this purpose. And my definition of minor being that the baseline is largely unchanged, despite discernible differences.
And that puts you again at starkly at odds with Mrs. Cook, who identifies, she now says, quote, significant harm in relation to that, to harm arising from that purpose, conflict with that purpose.
Yeah.
What's your reflections on, well, how her position appears to have been arrived at, to the extent you can understand that, and then, you know, what do you say in response to her on it?
She talked, I think it was in chief last night, about views from the countryside towards the existing urban edge being across fields. And if a section of that urban edge was closer, she felt that that was a significant change.
Yeah.
Now, in my view, the location of the site where the urban edge would be brought forward, as has been discussed, is quite a small parcel. It is visually well contained. Anywhere within that wider landscape where, which is accessible from where there are views, you would still have views across the larger agricultural fields before you get to the kill site. So I feel she's overstating it in arriving at a significant harm in relation to that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. And just the last question is, we've been through the detail of the Greenbelt issues, openness, and the two purposes which are contentious between us and the council. Taking a step back and asking ourselves about the overall extent of harm to the Greenbelt, put another way, the ability of the remaining Greenbelt, if permission is granted, the ability of the remaining Greenbelt parcel to function as Greenbelt, to do what the Greenbelt's got to do, you know, in terms of its spatial relationship between towns, etc. Do you have any reflections on that? If permission's granted, what would be the extent of overall harm on the Greenbelt that remains and its ability to function as Greenbelt?
Okay, well, breaking that down, so not talking about the appeal site, but talking about the wider Greenbelt landscape, which I think you're asking about. In terms of openness, I found negligible harm to the wider Greenbelt. In terms of purpose B, I found no conflict. Purpose C, I've said minor harm, but that's due to the encroachment within the site. Minimal change to the perception within the wider Greenbelt of encroachment. So overall, I'm identifying no change in terms of that wider Greenbelt in relation to how it performs its functions of openness and its purposes.
Mr. Crawford, thank you very much, sir. Sorry, that went on longer than I'd anticipated, but lots to go through. Not your fault at all, Mr. Crawford. I've got a lot of questions. Thank you very much, sir.
As on that last point, you said negligible and minimal, but then concluded no change. So I'm just trying to make that bridge from negligible and minimal to none, as opposed to still very low.
Okay, so yeah, so, I mean, negligible and minimal are both that, yeah, no, fair enough. They don't necessarily mean no change, but they mean no change of any consequence. Yeah, so perhaps I should say negligible change in how the wider Greenbelt will continue to perform rather than saying no change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think this feels like the time to have an afternoon break, if that's okay with everybody else, before you'd be in Perda. Would anyone like to raise anything before we have a short break?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Would 15 minutes be okay?
Fine with me, sir.
Okay, thank you. So it's currently 3:35, so we will resume at 3:50. Okay, thank you. The inquiry is adjourned. Okay, Mr. Atkinson. That's right, the inquiry is assumed, I should say.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let me just begin by giving you a menu, as my learned friends put it, your afternoon's fare. Starting with purposes, B and C, moving to openness, both aspects, and concluding then with character and appearance. Okay, so you know where we're going. You've given us your qualifications and experience, and you're a landscape architect.
Yes.
By training, and I think I understood you said that you've used the Glivia 3 methodology for the landscape and character assessment, and then you've adapted it to make your greenbelt judgments about purposes and openness. Is that the gist of it?
I wouldn't put it quite like that. Yes, so Glivia 3 covers landscape and visual assessment.
Yeah.
It's not so much a question of taking that and adapting it as of taking the broad approach of baseline and how it changes, and being clear on levels of harm, and using that to develop a greenbelt methodology.
Yeah, that's well, if you like, the structure from.
Yeah, yes.
Very good. And just so that we know what we're talking about, the parcel, which used the wider parcel, which you used for your assessment.
Yes.
It's essentially the council's area 25, less the bit in the far southeast.
That's right.
And if we look at your figure 1, we can see hopefully there you've marked
the green outline.
Yeah, and you've marked in white barley lands, which is it's that little triangle with the A129. That's the bit you've excluded.
Parcel 25 extends along the River Crouch till it meets the A129.
Yeah.
So that sort of triangle that projects around barley land is actually quite a different character from the rest of the parcel.
Yeah. Understood.
I felt it wasn't at all relevant to this site, so I excluded it.
And you've used the same parcel for all of your assessments. That's for purposes, openness, and character.
Yes.
Right. Well, let's start then with purpose B, to prevent neighbouring towns, as you know, from merging. And I would like to take you first to a document. I'm not sure we've been there yet, and I'm afraid I don't know what its CD reference is, but it's the 2017 Greenbelt Review, which Mrs. Cook exhibits at her appendix 2. You certainly find the excerpts there.
For what it's worth, I don't think I couldn't find the full document in the core docs.
Right.
It might not matter much if the relevant extracts is all we need. Whether it was, as you say, a Greenbelt review in 2017 that's referred to in the 2018 topic paper that we have been to.
Yeah, we'll be going back to that.
I reached
Okay,
the
so
same
I think it gets
just to say, I don't think it is a core document at the moment,
Okay,
but obviously, Inspector, if you want it, that's fine.
I need to find Mrs. Cook's evidence. Just be a moment. Okay, thank you.
So if within that excerpt we turn to page 39. Are they not marked?
Sorry, did you say there's an excerpt?
Mrs. Cook's
Mrs.
appendix
Cook's
2.
Oh, sorry, I've
Sorry.
printed off a few pages from it separately, so find Mrs. Cook. Oh, right, yes, I have it.
Yeah. So it's the table on page 39.
Yes.
And we can see from that table that this work I judged parcel 25 as a whole contributed to purpose 2.
Yes.
And we can see there's a text halfway down that text. There's a sentence beginning, this purpose considers the separation of Billericay to the north and Basildon to the south. The parcel is located within the smallest distance between the towns. If this parcel was released from Greenbelt, there would be a risk of these neighbouring towns merging. That's the rationale, essentially.
Yes,
That
which is
parcel.
talking about the whole parcel.
Understood. So the whole parcel is in the smallest, located within the smallest distance between the towns, and that must be true of our site too.
But broadly, yes.
Now we have been to the site 32 analysis. If we could turn to that, its proper title, its proper reference rather is it's CD 27.
Yes, I've got the site 32 part of it.
Yeah, I'm letting out how I prefer to describe it. And this deals with the purposes on its page 38. We've been through this already, but we can see that at the top of the right-hand column, that paragraph, it is considered, because of very limited footprint, location of existing development, it is considered that the static site 32 makes little contribution to parcel 2.
Yes, I see that, and that
Purpose two.
And that development here would be unlikely to compromise separation or rural break between Billericay and Basildon.
But it's right, isn't it, as Mrs. Cook observed today, this site 32 makes no assessment of encroachment purpose C.
It doesn't appear to, no.
And just for completeness, the 2018 topic paper, which is 26, page 58, we've been here
Yes.
many times, you can probably memorize it. Again, this analysis follows that in the site 32 analysis, and states at the bottom of that main paragraph in the central column, unlikely to compromise separation or rural break between Billericay or Basildon. The conclusion there overall is limited harm on the purposes.
Yes.
Again, it's right that this analysis doesn't include consideration of purpose C, encroachment.
Well, the second paragraph there doesn't. The first paragraph in that column says Area 25 makes a significant contribution to all the Greenbelt purposes.
Yeah.
So whilst the second paragraph, skimming through it, I think it only refers to setting and special character, effectively to purposes 2 and 4. The conclusion is limited harm on the openness of the green. Sorry, it is considered this development proposal will have limited harm on the openness of the green belt or the purposes of including land within it. So I don't know, but given that the first paragraph refers to all the purposes,
well, the first paragraph talking about,
it's quite possible that the final paragraph is referring to all the purposes.
First paragraph's talking about the broader area.
Yeah.
25, then it descends into this proposal, i.e. new site 3, basically our site. That's
Yeah,
right,
yes.
So it appears not to have made an assessment of purpose C encroachment.
Well, there's no explicit assessment of purpose C.
And the judgment that this document reaches limited harm to the purposes, excluding purpose C is the same assessment that Mrs. Cook makes as to the proposal and its harm on purpose B limited.
Sorry, are we just talking about purpose B or are we talking about purpose C?
Well, I'm making the observation that the 2008 topic paper assesses the purposes excluding purpose C, but concludes limited harm, which is the same assessment that Mrs. Cook makes in respect to the harm to purpose B.
Right. Well, I think I've already made clear I don't agree that where it says limited harm to purposes, it is necessarily not.
Now, I know you don't agree,
referring
but
to
that's
purpose C.
what the 2018.
But it's saying limited
said.
harm to purposes, and you're saying Mrs. Cook says limited harm to purpose B. I acknowledge Mrs. Cook says limited harm to purpose B, but
Don't worry, we're going to get into the detail of purpose B. I'm not.
well, yeah, sure, but I'm just looking at what this this document is saying.
Yeah.
In the final paragraph, saying limited harm to purposes. At the end of the previous paragraph, it's saying unlikely to compromise the separation or rural break between Billericay and Basildon. So I'm not sure it's saying limited harm to purpose B.
It's saying limited
seems
harm.
to me to be saying unlikely to harm purpose B.
Overall, limited harm to purpose.
So to purposes in general. Yeah.
Excluding C. All right, but what you say, in respect of purpose B, as I understand it, is essentially that there isn't any harm done to that purpose because what is proposed would not extend any further south than the housing on Southend Road.
As I made clear in chief, I've looked at two aspects: the sort of measurable physical distance of separation, which it wouldn't change, and the perception of separation, which I've also concluded it wouldn't change.
It would,
but that isn't because of the housing on Southend Road. That's a broader consideration of the perception within that area.
It's right to say that, as Mrs. Cook was saying this morning, or yesterday, no, today, to the east of Southend Road, across the site, the development would extend to the south from the current line of development on Mill Road, across the field, which is the
you mean to the west, I think, do you? So
to the west,
to the rear of the properties on Southend Road, it would be bringing that part of the settlement edge further south.
That's right. I mean, that is right, isn't it? And that surely would impact on what you rightly accept as an aspect of this judgment, the perception of merging between Billericay and Basildon.
Well, I've explained why I don't consider that it affects the perception of merging, which is because if you are within that greenbelt parcel, the wider greenbelt beyond the site boundary, you already have a perception of the proximity of Billericay, which arises from the visibility of the housing on Mill Road and those houses east of, on the west side of Southend Road.
Yeah.
And the addition of the appeal scheme in the corner, in my opinion, would not change one's perception of the degree. Put another way, it wouldn't create a perception that Billericay is advancing closer towards you southwards across the greenbelt.
So if we turn to LV4, viewpoint 4, perhaps that would be the time to look that up. Is CD 103. And just to be clear what we're looking at, the commercial development you refer to It's right to the right of this photograph. That's the blue.
Blue building and the
Circular.
buildings further right.
Southend Road, the houses on the western side of Southend Road aren't particularly visible from here.
I think that's right. I think they're possibly slightly further around the bend.
They're pretty much hidden. Then there's the road sign, and then to the left of that, that's looking across the site, isn't it? The appeal site towards the houses on Mill Road.
That's right.
And now you put the approximate location of site and the arrow there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't put it there.
Okay, sorry, no. I'm just wondering whether that, would it be reasonable to say that that location, that arrow actually indicates the western boundaries? It's the vegetation to the west of the site.
I think you're right. Yes, I think you're right. So most of the site is to the right of that arrow.
So we're looking to the right. Yeah. So we've accepted that Southend Road housing isn't visible from here.
From this particular location, but bear in mind that the viewpoints represent the experience of visual receptors. So motorists travelling along that road, of course,
will be driving.
In the time that we've been talking, they've gone round the bend and past the houses.
We hope they'll be driving, yeah.
Yeah.
It's right, isn't it, though, as Mrs. Cook says, that commercial development doesn't read as part of the edge of the settlement in the same way that Mill Road does. The commercial development to the east of Southend Road.
No, I don't agree with that.
Aside, really,
no, I don't agree with that. I mean, to be clear, I think that development is actually in the greenbelt. So
that's right. Yeah.
I'm not talking about in this instance about the boundary of the greenbelt, but motorists approaching along the road are obviously not aware of where the greenbelt boundary is, but what they see as they approach is they see housing to the left, and they see this range of buildings to the right, which some of them a bit further right appear to be agricultural buildings, just in terms of their appearance. These ones that we're seeing here definitely appear more commercial and agricultural. You see them at the same time as you see the housing to the left, and jointly they signify that you're arriving at a settlement.
And to the housing to the left, that's what I think we've agreed, that the housing to the left that we can see from here is looking across the site itself towards Mill Road.
Yes, and further left on Mill Road to the west of the site.
Yeah, and what would happen were the proposal to be granted is that the development would come forward towards the viewer, as it were, approximately
by about 100 metres.
And would spread across that view.
But across that central section of that view.
And that would be more prominent, surely, than the existing housing on Southend Road.
It would be closer. I'm not sure it would be more prominent. But existing housing is pretty prominent throughout that area south of the site.
But by virtue of being closer, one could assume, just one's vision, it would figure larger, wouldn't it? In
terms of perspective, it would, yes, they would appear on the sense that things that are closer appear larger, yes.
Yeah.
But it would still be further away than that commercial development on the right. And as you go a little bit further around the corner, it would be slightly further away than the first of the existing houses on Southend Road.
So the visibility from the south. I just wanted to be clear about what is proposed in terms of landscaping on that southern boundary, the one we're looking at. And if you could turn again, sorry, I don't have the CD number, but in Miss Bevan's appendix C, there's the landscaping plans, including two soft landscaping proposals.
CD 53 and 4, I think.
Thank you.
If further wrote it on this plan was right.
We'll come to that, and do you have it? Sorry, Mr. Crawford.
I've got Miss Bevan's proof, but I don't think it's got the latest plans in it.
Right, the soft landscaping.
So yeah, Appendix C of Miss Bevan's proof, the plans there don't show any new tree planting on the southern boundary.
Right.
So they're not the latest ones.
Okay.
I can. Oh, I don't know if my team can help with the core docs reference.
Actually, yes, in order to CD 54, so that must be.
Yeah, CD 106 has a coloured master plan,
Oh, that's the master plan. Yeah, I have that.
which does show 4 trees on the southern boundary. I don't know.
I see. So that's the additional. Okay. So I think, is it right then, putting them together? Soft landscape proposal shows no trees. Well, it shows 5 around the open space.
Got it in front of me. Well, yes, 5 on the south side of the open space. Yes.
Outside, and then what's being added are trees between 15 and 12 at the back of the plots there.
Yes, which is the section of that southern boundary hedgerow that currently lacks significant trees. Further east along that boundary, there are existing quite large trees.
Yeah. And then further over to the east, what is proposed is still the ornamental hedge behind 9 and 7.
9 and 7. Right. Well, that's not an ornamental hedge, that's a native species hedge. Looking at the mix on that drawing. You're looking at planting plan, the ACD.
Yeah.
Environmental, yeah, so there's on the east side of plot 7, it's labelled with the planting mix, Carpinus betulus, Corylus avellana, etc. Those are native hedgerow species, such as you find in rural hedgerows.
The key describes it as proposed ornamental hedge planting.
No, it says native hedge.
Native
The uncoloured
Ornamentals
one,
to the central part of the site.
that's right, so the uncoloured one is native hedge,
Actually,
the green one is ornamental.
okay, so essentially, there will be some amendment, there'll be some development, some further planting along that southern boundary.
Yes,
But it can't be said, can it, that the proposals will be less prominent from the south? So I think it's what you're saying.
that's prominent than what?
Well, this is what I wasn't too sure. I think you're saying it'd be less prominent than the existing developments in the region. Less visually prominent than existing houses on Southend Road.
Can you give me a reference?
You're
Oh, sorry, I've got
1.29.
it. 732, is it in mine?
1.29.
Oh, that's my summary, yeah.
I think it's over the same in 6.5. That section.
Yes, the same as 7.3.2. Yeah. So less prominent than the existing houses on Southend Road as you get a bit further round the bend.
But not
And
not
less
from viewpoint
prominent,
4.
slightly north of viewpoint 4, yes. And less prominent than the commercial developments on the east side of Southend Road. So in that photograph, you can see the prominence of that commercial development.
Yeah.
The inspector will be able to see the prominence of the existing houses on Southend Road as he drives to site.
And as you know, Mrs. Cook's view is that the housing, by being brought forward 100 metres, would be more prominent than.
Yeah, I disagree. I don't think she's taken account of the boundary vegetation. But, you know, bear in mind that when I was running through the visual effects, I was describing year 1 and year 15 effects. The level of effect I assess reduced by year 15 as the new planting establishes. Clearly, at year 1, that new planting won't be having an effect.
Is your position in respect of this purpose to prevent merging? Is it that it is respected, the purpose is intact, if you like, right up until two towns become physically contiguous?
No.
So there are degrees of encroachment.
Now, I've talked about the perception of separation, needing to consider both the physical distance of separation and the perception of separation. And even in terms of distance, where settlements have grown close to each other but are not physically touching, there's kind of the remaining land between them is more critical to performing that purpose, because frankly it's the only thing preventing complete merger.
So following that rationale, it'd be right, so even a small site could erode this purpose. It could contribute negatively. It could fail to prevent towns from merging in a perceptual sense.
Are you talking when they are almost merged, or are you talking?
Well, I'm talking about this site. It's a small site that you've accepted, but it's not that there are degrees of encroachment.
Okay, so
sorry, there are degrees of merging.
Just change the question. A small site, in general, hypothetically, could contribute to the performance of this purpose. This site, I believe, doesn't contribute to it.
All right. In terms of purpose C, encroachment, you said something in chief about an overlap between perception of encroachment and perception of openness, erosion of openness, and you see them as
I think the perceptual aspects are quite similar, yes. On the one hand, it's about being in the countryside, but being aware of the proximity of the settlement edge. That's the openness point. You are aware that there is development nearby.
Yeah.
The encroachment point is that if you have a visible settlement edge or other signs of the proximity of settlement, it decreases the rurality, if you like, the countryside-ness of the countryside. So I'd say very similar factors play into the perceptual aspect in both cases, but you are ultimately looking at slightly different things, which is there development here, or how rural is this landscape?
Understood. And you say that there is, well, inevitably encroachment when a site outside the settlement boundary is developed.
by definition.
By definition, that inevitability doesn't diminish the harm though that might arise.
No. No, it doesn't.
And as I understand it, you say that the appeal site is already encroached upon by the urbanising influence of the existing housing to the north, essentially the Mill Road frontage, if you like, which is part of, as I understand it, the development which you say is widely visible within the assessment parcel.
Yes.
But elsewhere, you describe how the vegetation around the site significantly limits its intervisibility with the wider landscape.
Yes.
Okay, so the development on Mill Road is widely visible from within the assessment parcel. But at the same time, you're saying the site is visually contained with limited intervisibility.
Yes. So go back to the photographs in the LVIA.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at photograph 4.
Yeah.
And you don't see a continuous line of houses on Mill Road as you look across that section where you're looking across the site and further to the left, because the boundary vegetation partly screens it.
Right.
The new planting will increase, the new proposed tree planting would increase the degree of that screening. So we're talking here about the southern boundary. Photograph 2 shows the situation with the western boundary, which I talked about in chief, where which is a still more substantial vegetation with a lot of mature trees. So that screens to a higher degree than the southern boundary vegetation.
So it'd be fair to say, wouldn't it, that the intervisibility, which you say is limited, it's less limited from the south?
Yes.
From where the existing housing is widely visible.
The existing housing is also widely visible from the west. I pointed it out on viewpoints 1 and 2. So I mean, yes, the housing on Mill Road west of the site, is also very visible in viewpoints west of the site.
Okay, so we have a situation then where, in order for the urbanising influence you described to exert an encroachment, which is what you're saying, you need to accept then, don't you, that this existing housing is quite visible from the south?
Yeah, parts of it are, yeah.
Okay.
You can see that clearly. Photograph 4.
Yeah, because there, as you say, we're actually looking across the appeal site, aren't we?
Yes, we're looking across the appeal. Well,
Road, yeah. So
one section of it we're looking across the appeal site, and other sections of it we're looking west of the appeal site.
And you were fairly acknowledged that the arrow indicates the western boundary, so it's everything to the right of that.
It's towards the west, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So turning then to the existing buildings on the site, because that's another aspect of the urbanisation you described. You've seen them, the inspector's seen them. A mixture. They're all single story from memory.
They're certainly recorded as that. I've just got a vague recollection that one of them might have an upper story, but certainly the majority are.
And then, yeah, okay. We know that the use, well, the only use we actually have evidence of is of the equestrian use, the stables. The stables, a horse use is something which one might expect to see in a rural setting.
You might, but as I mentioned in chief, equestrian uses are quite often characteristic of a peri-urban, a settlement edge landscape.
Urban fringe.
Yeah.
Suburban was the word.
Well, I would say suburban is the built environment at the edge of the settlement, and peri-urban is the countryside around the edge of the settlement, which is where the equestrian.
And you accept, sorry,
I was just going to say that's where the site is. So
you accept that perception is important to the sense of encroachment and indeed openness.
Yes,
it's not just straightforward assessment. It requires this kind of judgment. You accept that the nature of the buildings and the use to which they are put can have a bearing on one's perception of encroachment.
Yes.
And you've accepted that whilst horse use may be peri-urban, I think is your phrase, or urban fringe, it is equally a use which one might associate with the countryside.
Yes, yes.
And these are factors which the inspector would have to take into account when he's making his own judgment.
Of course.
So it'd be reasonable to say, wouldn't it, that whilst of course there is a measure of physical encroachment, and we'll come to that in a bit more detail when we come to openness, the nature of the buildings and their use on the site currently is not particularly urbanizing.
It's not particularly mean. They have a.
Their uses that
I would say they have a strong settlement edge character. And that settlement edge character decreases the rurality, if you like, of the landscape, which represents a degree of encroachment.
As you know, Mrs. Cook finds the significant encroachment in this case, and that must be right, mustn't it?
Well, I've found minor harm in terms of encroachment. My scale of harm, minor means that there is a minor alteration in relevant characteristics or features, such that the baseline is largely unchanged despite discernible differences. So I stand by that. You would see from vantage points within the wider green belt, you would see the change, it would be discernible, but the overall nature of those views, of your perception of the nature of the countryside, would be largely unchanged. It's countryside where you're already very aware of the settlement edge, you can see a lot of buildings, etc., and that would be largely unchanged.
Okay, well, we disagree about that. Moving on then to openness, dealing first with the spatial aspect. I actually had done the figures myself, which the inspector asked for, and I got to the same as you have presented.
It's good news, isn't it?
Well, actually, first of all, I got 88% increase, but then my maths was faulty. So the footprint is an 80% increase, and the volume is 124%.
That's correct.
Increase in what is there. But then you've done something which I was curious about. You then divide the site, don't you? And you make the point, well, if we consider the eastern part where there is existing development separate from the paddocks, then there's actually a lower quantum of development proposed for that eastern part than is currently there. And that's, I just wanted to ask you about that. I mean, that's essentially the opposite of the approach you've taken elsewhere, where you've assessed the appeal site as a whole, but then put it in the context of your wider parcel.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, if you assess harm broadly of this sort across a wider area,
Mm-hmm.
the smaller the site, the less the harm. But what you've done here by dividing the site into small parts seems rather artificial, doesn't it? The site is going to be developed as a whole.
I haven't divided the site. I haven't assessed one part of the site and then assessed the other part of the site. I've assessed the effect of the spatial change in the quantum of development across the site as a whole. Well, in order to do that, we need to understand what's going on. We're starting from a baseline where there is a significant quantum of development on roughly a third of the site, and none on the other 2/3 apart from the small stable. And we're going to a situation where overall we've got roughly twice the quantum, but it's spread more or less evenly over the site.
Yeah.
So in understanding the implications of that, clearly the implications for the part of the site, the paddocks, are different from the implications
So you
part of the site where there is.
Treated parts of the site separately, haven't you?
I've only made one assessment, which is of the site as a whole, where I say moderate loss of openness.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to arrive at that assessment, it's necessary to understand what's going on. And, you know, very simply, if the current situation compared with the proposed is that we've got about half the quantum of development, and that half is on a third of the site, and we're then going to an evenly spread scenario, it must mean for that third of the site we're getting a reduction in quantum, and then we're getting the rest of it on the other part of the site. But what I haven't done is said, so the level of harm on this part of the site is X and the level of harm on that part of the site is Y. I've made one assessment for the whole site, but in order to make that assessment, to understand the nature of the change in the two parts of the site.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you say it's 7.2.3. The proposed development will be spread fairly evenly, including the paddocks, which are currently free from development, with a reduction in the quantum of developments in the eastern part of the site, where the existing development is concentrated. So
Precisely.
Yeah. So you are in effect splitting the site into its two component parts.
No, I'm not. I'm doing what I've just said I'm doing. I don't say there, so the level of harm in the eastern part of the site is X, and the level of, or even a benefit,
Well,
arguably,
what's
and
the
the
point
level
of
of
that?
harm in the western part of the site.
What's the point of that passage if it doesn't affect your assessment of harm?
The point, well, it does affect my assessment of, it informs my assessment of harm for the site as a whole, which is at 7.29, where I bring together the spatial with the visual and other aspects. And as I said, it's about understanding what's going on. So we've got a doubling of quantum. Is this quantum all in the same place as the existing? Is it in a completely different place than the existing? if it is in a completely different place, then we're taking away quantum from the first, but it's actually, it's not either of those things, it's kind of in between. It's about understanding the process that is occurring in moving from the existing situation to the proposed situation, so that rationally I can reach a conclusion as to the level of harm for the site as a whole.
And the site will be read as a whole, clearly,
Yes.
when it's,
Yes.
if proposal is, yeah. All right, one of the things then I wasn't clear about from your evidence or in chief was whether you had or hadn't included in your figures an assessment of the area or volume of the fences and other ancillary items and so on, which you refer to.
In terms of in the figures,
Yeah.
No.
No.
And forgive me, I thought that was fairly clear. And the figures are all clearly to do with building footprint and building volume. And then 7.2.4, I say, in addition to buildings, there will be these other bits and pieces. So I've borne them in mind in making my assessment, but they aren't included in the measurements.
And were you saying at 7.2.4 that the existing fencing ancillary items within the site, and you mentioned a couple of doors being used as fencing, are you suggesting that those existing features will be comparable to the spatial components of the building structures, boundary walls, fences, street furniture?
Comparable as in equivalent to?
Comparable, like the same sort of level or less or more, or?
No. What I'm saying is that there are features which are not buildings, which have a spatial dimension in relation to sides of the equation. So whilst the figures I've quoted
Exclude them.
are for the buildings only, I'm acknowledging and I'm taking account of the fact that as well as buildings, there is other stuff, both in the existing situation and the proposed situation.
And do you accept, or are you saying that the other stuff, if I can put it that way, and nothing wrong with that, with the appeal scheme would be quite considerably greater volume on area than the existing other stuff?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think in terms of the spatial aspect, the buildings are going to be the predominant factor in either scenario.
Of course. All right. Visually then, the openness, you rely on the additional planting, as I understand it, to limit the visual perception, the visual aspect of erosion of the openness on the southern boundary. It's largely it, isn't it?
I wouldn't say I rely on it. I'm simply making an assessment of the degree of harm that will arise from the scheme as proposed.
Yeah, be limited.
That takes into account the additional planting. And I'm pretty sure I do say somewhere in my proof that given that permanence is one of the two overriding characteristics of the green belt, when I'm drawing from the landscape and visual assessment, I think it's the year 15, the long-term effects that are more relevant in terms of informing the green belt harm than the shorter term effects. So therefore, in considering the green belt harm, I've considered that planting once established and maturing.
And you make the same point here about the existing development on Mill Road and Southend Road being more prominent than will be the proposed development.
Yes.
From the south. Well, we've been through that. We have the same tension, don't we? On the one hand, you say the site is currently influenced is an urbanizing influence from the existing development along Mill Road, which therefore is obviously visible. Yes, on the other hand, you rely on the proposals being nonetheless less prominent than that housing, despite being 100 metres further south.
Yeah, well, I've already addressed that point. I think you put precisely the point to me and answered it. I'm happy to answer it again. Yes, as we can see from various of the photographs in the LVIA, the housing on the existing edge, Mill Road, Church Street, Southend Road. Sorry, Southend Road isn't visible in any of the LVI photos, but is visible when the inspector goes to site. That existing housing is in places quite prominent. The proposed scheme is well concealed in terms of the western boundary, and fairly well concealed in terms of the southern boundary, and the proposed tree planting, both the trees in the southwest corner that were on the outdated plans and the additional trees on the boundary in the revised plans, will further reduce the visibility of the screen, so of the scheme. So yes, I consider it will be less prominent than some of that other development, which is largely unscreened.
In terms of the activity on the site, which you address, your 726, 727, it's right that currently, so far as we know from Mr. Leach's stat deck, there are five horses kept and ridden. Perhaps we could turn to the stat deck. The best thing to do actually. I'm afraid I don't. Oh, CD 156. Do you have it?
It's just opening, I think. Yeah, got it.
So it describes the history and so on. Relevant paragraph is paragraph 12. Where he's talking about the current use. It says, currently we have 5 horses in our stables. My daughter-in-law and her daughter have 2 horses. And my granddaughter has a horse. My wife's friend also uses our stables and keeps 2 there. So it seems that there are currently 5 horses kept and ridden.
Yes.
Daughter-in-law plus daughter have 2. Granddaughter has 1. Wife's friend has 2.
Mm-hmm.
So 5 horses, 4 people looking after them. There are no floodlights or anything on the sand school that I
don't think so.
I think well, Mrs. Cook suggested this horse activity is likely to be during daylight hours. So the current activity you're talking about arises from those horses and those carriers, if you like, riders.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And what's proposed is, well, 47 houses it would be reasonable, wouldn't it, to imagine that there would be, let's say, between 100, 150 people living within those 47. It depends on the breakdown, obviously, of the size of them, but obviously life goes on 24 hours, 7, coming and going, night and day, cars, so on, within the site, people moving about, kids playing. Surely that degree of activity is likely to be far greater during the operational phase than.
Yes.
Good. You agree with that?
I say in my proof during the operational phase, when I talk of increased movements of pedestrians and vehicles. But yes, of those other activities you talk about too, certainly I agree.
But you make the distinction between the appeal site itself and the wider adjoining area, where you say that we have no perception of that at the point. Unlike his being.
Yes, I guess admittedly in relation to the degree of activity, I'm focusing within my proof more on what that does to the perception of the openness of the wider green belt. I guess on the basis that self-evidently within the site, you're going to be aware of the activity within the site. So yeah, that may be an oversight. I should have been specific about that, but I've focused on, as I say, what that does to the perception of the openness of the wider green belt. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the visual one, you know, in terms of perception of openness of the wider green belt. There's no direct effect of the spatial dimension. That's not in the wider green belt, but what you see and activity you may or may not be aware of are signifiers that would indicate the proximity of development and potentially affect the perception of openness. So that's the angle I've focused on.
All right, then finally, character and appearance. Just to understand your approach, your starting point is LCA 12, but you distinguish the appeal site from the wider LCA 12 area. And for the three reasons we've been through already, really: the visual containment of the site by the boundaries, the urbanizing influence of the existing housing, and of the existing development on the site. So it's the same factors you rely on to distinguish the appeal site from the characteristics of the LCA 12 area.
Yeah, so we're talking about landscape character, so it's also the much smaller scale of the parcel compared with
LCA 12.
I talked about the medium large agricultural fields, the different land use. Yes, the direct relationship with existing development to the north and east, the existing buildings on the site, and the points you picked up: equestrian use, boundary hedgerows, etc.
Yeah, so it's essentially.
So there's quite a number of factors that give the site a different character from the prevailing character over the majority of LCA 12.
Yeah, and it's those. It's the same distinguishing factors, really, that which you use throughout your assessment. It's those three, really. It's the visual containment.
Unsurprisingly, I mean, I'm assessing the effects of a development proposal on the particular site. So the characteristics of the site and of its context are going to inform the various different strands of that assessment. It would be odd if they didn't.
Very well. Well, I don't propose to go through them again. As you know, we have a difference of opinion in outcome, the effect of the character and appearance. Yeah. So, thank you, Mr. Crawford. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any re-examination?
No, sir. Is there anything from you, sir?
No.
That's it, sir, from Mr. Crawford. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Now, 10 to 5, sir. I mean, it probably err on the side of, I think we would probably err on the side of stopping now. I mean, we've obviously had quite a long day. I mean, always keen to crack on and make use of time, but we've probably got more than 45 minutes of chief on planning. So we'd be going, I mean, if we'd be going more in the direction of 6-ish, that not 6, but that kind of thing. I
think given that we are sort of ahead of schedule, that seems unnecessary. I mean, it'd be something I might do if we really had to do it to fit it in, but we're not at that stage, so I don't think it's necessary.
And you've got the one more witness to do, obviously. So if you're content to kick off again at 9:30 tomorrow, we should, he says optimistically, be done with the formal evidence by around lunchtime or early afternoonish sort of thing at the latest.
So yes, I was thinking about that. So that would mean could we then do conditions in 106 tomorrow afternoon? But does that rely on where we actually get to today?
We could do conditions. The only fly in the ointment is that our solicitor, who we want to be here for the 106 session, just in case, is only available on Friday morning, which is a pain, but not the end of the world, because we've got time on Friday morning to do it all, and we'll still be having an early day on Friday, I'm sure, as well, if all we're doing is 106, maybe conditions as well, and closings. So I just wonder, we could have another look at conditions certainly tomorrow, sir. Another thing that you could consider, I know we've not anticipated doing it within the week, but you could consider doing a site visit tomorrow afternoon if you've got the time. Obviously you don't have to, but that's another option.
Yes, so that was my question about when it does feel like now that there should be a possibility for site visit within the week. I mean, if you are comfortable with having the conditions on 106 and closings all on the final day, but tomorrow afternoon having the site visit.
We are, sir, yeah.
So the only question then is, I would like to have an agreed sort of route, because you've mentioned that footpath, which obviously I've noted down.
Yeah.
Perhaps both sides can just think about things they definitely want me to look at and consider.
I wonder whether now that Mr. Crawford's finished, I know it's really quite late, but maybe maybe now or an hour-ish, I don't know whether the parties might be able to knock their heads together and just wonderful. Wonderful. Maybe we could just try and sort that now while we're all in the room, kind of thing, and then we can get that finalised for you tomorrow. So we can do it tomorrow afternoon if use of time.
And I suppose that could either be unaccompanied or accompanied. If it's during the course, it'd be up to you, really. But if it's during the course of inquiry, then I'm easy either way. I don't really mind. Perhaps if you can both sort of talk about that issue as well, then tomorrow morning we can finalise that. But in principle, I'm happy with that.
Well, I suppose, Martix, you might not be here if it's not accompanied. You can't. I think we're content for it to be unaccompanied if the council is, but equally we're not fussed if the council would prefer it to be accompanied. They can obviously say, of course. So it might just be worth knowing now, is what I'm saying, so that you know whether to come in tomorrow.
Okay,
fine. In that case, if we say it's going to be, Friday, then
it's not just us. It's county, so that's more difficult. I can drag my light, but I can't drag.
So that'll be Friday. Then.
Okay, so I think then we keep Friday as is, as programmed. Tomorrow, it would be Mr. Bell followed by site visit when that finishes. And that's unaccompanied, so it really matters to anybody else, as long as it's agreed in the morning.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that will be we'll be gone well before then, hopefully. Yeah, well, we can show up at the cabinet meeting. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, even if we're not doing positions in 106 tomorrow morning, I still need the documents really then.
Oh yeah,
because.
Do you hear that? We'd be happy, I think, for the 106 to just be sent in now, subject to county comments.
That's fine, yeah, I'm happy.
Who's got it? Have they got it?
Yeah, we can say that's fine, yes.
If that could be sent in now.
Yes, we sent it now, yeah.
So that's the 106, and then
The conditions have gone already. The conditions have gone already.
they're in, are they? Great. So you should be getting all of that then, hopefully, today. But, great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
There you go. Job done.
Okay, I think that covers everything. Can we leave things in the room this evening?
Well then,
Okay.
site visit then, so everything else Friday. Nothing else from us, no.
Okay. All right. Okay. In that case, thank you, everybody. The inquiry is adjourned. Thank you.